Tweet @TodaySOR.
Now, Fianna Fáil to publish roadmap for a united Ireland. That's what the headline in the Irish Times says this morning. The man drawing up the roadmap is party leader Micheál Martin, and he joins us now. Micheál Martin, good morning.
Good morning, John.
This is all a bit sudden. How is it going to happen?
Well, it's not that sudden, John, in the sense that we've been working. I've been thinking and reflecting on this for quite some time, and the catalyst for this, in many ways, is to move away from an emotion charge to push towards an Irish unity, and to look at it in more practical terms and ask some very basic questions. So we're putting together a white paper that seeks to define what would a united Ireland look like if there was a referendum in line with the Good Friday Agreement, which says that if there's a majority in the North in favour of United Ireland, then a referendum would be triggered. In our view, before you trigger any referendum at any time, there would need to be some clear idea or some clear blueprint as to what a United Ireland would look like in the aftermath of such a referendum.
So what would it look like?
And the white paper isn't over yet, but essentially the questions we're looking at: would there be two parliaments, North and South, as we currently have? Would you have two? Would you have a government and a republic and one in the North? In my view, you would continue to have those kind of arrangements. In terms of education and health, how would you integrate, for example, the two health services? In my view, we should, in education, there's further potential cooperation and development of new bodies in terms of curriculum and in terms of a joint all-island approach to the development of third-level education and research, and particularly in the Brexit context, that Northern Ireland universities and institutes would continue to have access to the European Research Programme, for example. There should be one all-island food safety body, in my view. There should be one Enterprise Ireland, merging of Invest Northern Ireland and Enterprise Ireland to promote small to medium-sized Irish companies on the island of Ireland.
One corporate tax rate?
In overseas trade missions, and develop a common corporate tax harmonisation as well that would facilitate indirect investment. Now, these are ideas that we've put forward in the context of strengthening the North-South economic relationship. And in short, our view is that there's an obligation on anybody who aspires to Irish unity to lay out a blueprint as to what it would look like. And crucially, it would have to involve the same sets of relationships that currently are involved in the Good Friday Agreement, i.e. the British-Irish relationship, the North-South relationship, and of course the relationship between the two traditions on the island, and particularly within Northern Ireland itself.
You have this notion in your proposal that this block grant from Britain of the order of whatever it is, 20 billion, would continue to be paid after unification?
That's a suggestion I put forward. Northern Ireland can't come off a cliff if such a vote was to take place. And furthermore, the British dimension to the Irish question has to be retained in many forms, just as the whole idea of the Good Friday Agreement was to, in many ways, give a very stronger Irish dimension to the constitution governing the North and the island. So therefore we removed Articles 2 and 3, which were perceived to be a threat to Northern Unionism, and we replaced it with articles and with the Good Friday Agreement, which is an international agreement, which essentially highlights the parity of esteem between two traditions, the need for peace and harmony and consensus, and not in any way forcing the pace or endeavouring to put undue pressure on one community vis-a-vis another. And that's the overriding principle that I put forward, the idea that it has to be consensus, it has to be by harmony, and we can't use Brexit or endeavour to exploit Brexit.
But are you not doing that, though?
No.
In announcing this plan, aren't you really flying a kite post-Brexit and post the Assembly elections last week?
Well, actually, we announced some time ago that we were working on a white paper. I think the Irish Times are doing a series on the Irish unity question, and they invited us to an interview with Faye Kelly, and that's the context in which today's article is written. It still is work in progress, but I'm very minded that the problem with the North and since its inception has been that an ugly majoritarianism developed, which became inherently sectarian in the government that was formed. In my view, we cannot replace that with something else. In other words, it can't be boiled down to 51% versus 49% in some future referendum. That's the essence of what I'm about and what we are about. We're saying there's a requirement, there's an obligation to spell out how you would do it, because it's far more difficult. The detail is far more difficult than the principle. It can't be the romantic pursuit of the fourth green field anymore, John. It has to be hard-headed, it has to be practical, and it has to be seen to work.
And when do you think it could happen?
If we just make the margin, if we learn anything from Brexit, be wary of politicians promoting referendums or border polls, because they become divisive and they become ugly.
But surely this isn't going to... Yeah, but you talk about divisive. This isn't going to be greeted with enthusiasm by moderate unionists who will be saying at this particular time that in the wake of last week's result, what you should really be doing is focusing on efforts to ensure that there's a restoration of power sharing in Northern Ireland.
Well, I mean, I didn't bring down the power sharing administration. Sinn Féin did that with the disagreement with the DUP, and the DUP behaved in an appalling manner both on the Renewable Heat initiative and subsequently in the election, where in many ways it polarised both communities. But obviously we want the restoration of the institutions in the Good Friday Agreement. But unionism, and I know many unionists, and I know quite a number of loyalists as well, and have worked with them, they understand that where Fianna Fáil comes from is you know, a United Ireland perspective. But they do understand that Fianna Fáil is a constitutional Republican party, that we understand the need for consensus and peace building and better relationships between the two traditions on the island. So they understand that, and if anything, we are endeavouring to take the emotion out of this and move it forward on a more pragmatic basis.
You say that you could see this happening in your lifetime.
Well, again, I mean, I'm wary of that type of deadline. I think Fianna Kelly put that to me, and I said it to him actually. I said, who knows how long anybody's going to live? So I think there's a bit of melodrama about that phrase, will it happen in my lifetime? It may, it may not. I simply do not know. But again, I would make the point, John, I don't think it's going to happen like some people think, that it's just after a referendum, high presto, you wake up and we're in United Ireland. I think it's much more evolutionary. And I believe if we keep the idea of maintaining and nurturing the three sets of relationships between the British people and the Irish people, between people in the Republic and people in the North, and between the Unionist and Loyalist communities and the Nationalist communities in the North itself, that has to be, those three pillars are essential to any new dispensation and are central to anything that may happen if a referendum was triggered in the future. And that's something that may not happen for quite some time yet, if it's to happen, because that has to be in line with the Good Friday Agreement, where the British government judges that or makes an assessment that there's a majority in favour now.
Mary says, one of our texters says, it sounds like Fianna Fáil is getting nervous about Sinn Féin's rise in popularity.
So we've heard that for about 10 years, for God's sake, John. I mean,
but it is, in some ways, it aligns your position nicely with what Sinn Féin has been saying.
It's actually very different. Because Sinn Féin...
the goal ultimately is the same.
Sinn Féin have been driving these border polls for the last 2 to 3 years. The idea of a border poll, which has, in my view, has been somewhat divisive and ridiculous. And I think there is an obligation on parties to be far more detailed in the kind of blueprint that they have in mind, that they envisage. And that's what we're doing. And I think we're doing it in a constructive way. And that's the context that we do. I mean, since our inception as a political party, we've aspired to Irish unity. Fianna Fáil was central to the breakthroughs in the cessation of violence with Albert Reynolds, the work of Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair, two governments coming ever closer together to underpin the evolution and the constitutional settlement in the Good Friday Agreement. So we have a very strong constitutional peace-focused approach in terms of building consensus.
But you're lining up nicely with Sinn Féin broadly on this. You need, or not need, but this aspiration for a united Ireland and your roadmap. So it would take away another reason why you wouldn't go into government with them at the next election.
No, John, I think you're very much wide of the mark there. The fundamental reason why we're not going to government with Sinn Féin after the next election is because we're very mindful of the fact that the police in Northern Ireland, the PSNI Féin and indeed the intelligence services have made it very clear that Sinn Féin is not a democratically run party, and that shadowy forces and the Army Council of the IRA still control and dictate a lot of what goes on there. So there's a lot of issues there in terms of that issue that is the main central plank as to why we're not going into government with Sinn Féin in the Republic. And I would make the point to you, I have to make the point to you, that from the inception of the party, Irish unity has always been an aspiration of Fianna Fáils. But I think in light of the Brexit poll, John, if we learn anything, be wary of politicians who promote the idea of a referendum without having the foggiest idea of what will happen the day after that referendum is passed. And that's what we learned from the Boris Johnsons and the Michael Goves of this world, who, called for a referendum on Britain coming out of the European Union. We all saw the shock on their faces when the Brexit vote won. And it's been confusion and mayhem in the last 9 months in terms of they endeavouring to put a blueprint together as to the United Kingdom's future relationship with the European Union.
Incidentally,
we should learn from that, and we should move, develop a blueprint of what it might look like. And people may not like that, and people may have a different view and different perspective on that. And this is all going to take obviously quite some time. But in my view, there is a lot of common ground. And I've mentioned to you, for example, the Enterprise Agency idea, the Food Safety Authority idea, the idea of the curriculum, John, English and history, for example. We need to develop a common understanding of our history. And one way of doing that is to develop a North-South curriculum support body that would have
Micheál Martin, we'd have to leave that.
Frank McGuinness on the curriculum in the North and in the Republic and vice versa.
We'll have to leave the subject there, but before you go, can I ask you about the story we dealt with before we spoke to you, and that's the efforts by Minister for Transport Shane Ross to ensure that all drivers convicted of drink driving receive a mandatory disqualification from driving. Presumably you've received the letter from the Vintners Federation along with other TDs and senators. Do you support what he's trying to do?
I'm very, to be frank with you, we haven't received huge representations from any particular quarter on this. And when we saw it first, we felt he was diverting attention away from other issues that he was under pressure on. I mean, there is, in our view, enforcement is the key. And when we had a very strong enforcement regime, we made very significant impact on drunk driving and on speeding. The issue is, for us, enforcement. The idea of going to zero.
So you don't favour the.
Well, we need to look at that very carefully before jumping in on it, because I think without question we made huge progress, and drink driving became a no-no, particularly for quite a large majority of our younger people and younger generation. And I think there's been a cultural shift on the drink driving issue, and we need more on speeding as well. And the enforcement issue has become noticeably less visible in the last number of years, and I think that is where all the resources should go.
Micheál Martin, thank you for joining us. Back in a moment, we'll be talking about Yemen.
Today with Sean O'Rourke on RTE Radio 1.